Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And we have a really exciting guest on today that ever since we saw him on another podcast, which shall not be named, we said we need to get him on ours. So we are very happy to welcome Lee Krähenbühl here with us today. How are you, Lee?
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Rebecca.
Excellent. Excellent. So, Landon, why don't you read his bio? And I think the bio might give people an idea of what we're going to talk about today.
I think so, or hope so. Dr. Lee Krähenbühl is chair of the Department of Communication and director of the graduate program in communication at Stevenson University in Owings Mills, Maryland, where he serves as professor of communication in the School of Design, Arts, and Communication. He is a past president of the Maryland Communication Association and has taught communication, entertainment history, theater, and world religions at the college and university levels for nearly 40 years. And that's quite a combination, quite a unique combination of courses. Dr. Krähenbühl is also a singer, songwriter, actor, director, designer of both traditional and online curricula, and scholar of the interaction of the performing arts and religious movements in the Western Hemisphere from early Mesoamerica to the present, with special emphasis on North America in the 19th century. So quite a spread.
That's right. No, we're absolutely thrilled because theater is in my blood. I run a youth theater program for about the last 20 years. And
God bless you.
Yeah, exactly. God bless me. Yeah, my husband and I started it back in 2004, and I just realized, oh, it's the 20th year. I can't believe we've survived. So it's been really fun, though. And theater is huge. It has a huge part to play, no pun intended, in religion, in culture, in everything. It's very important. So we have Lee on today to give us a look at some of the origins of theater in Mormonism and some of those early days. So I think we're just going to let you take it away, and we'll just be in awe of the information.
I just have to say, Lee, I am surprised how in the post-Mormon world, how many people we meet who say, I'm a theater major. I mean, we run into them everywhere. A lot from BYU, and they just, I'm going, how are so many theater people involved with post-Mormondom? But it seems to be a theme that we run into quite a bit. So this is really fascinating.
You come by it honestly. It is the theater is a pre-Mormon, Mormon, and post-Mormon phenomenon. It is baked into the culture. And the reason for that, well, I will go ahead and share the question that I want to ask, which is this. The question is, why is there zero curiosity in the Orthodox LDS world about its own vital role in American theater history? I don't have an answer to that question yet. All I know is that when I have conversations with my friends, the closer they are to the center of LDS culture, the fewer questions they ask about why exactly the Mormons are involved in theater in the first place. Why is that okay? So I'd like to start with a quote by the historian Richard Pohl. And he makes the following observation in an essay called God and Man in History in the journal Dialogue. Apart from the veneration of certain idealized episodes, we Mormons have forgotten our past. And some of us would appreciate not being reminded.
That's a very good quote. I'm going to have to get that from you because I was going to say in answer to your question, I think that is kind of what it is. We have to adhere to a very strict narrative to make everything work for us. And when you stray off that path and perhaps look at other historical events or put things in a context, you may not like what you find. So we are presented with a very strict narrative, and we're very happy to stay with it. And we don't delve into some of the other questions until we maybe stray ourselves a little away from Mormonism. So that would be my answer. Very simplistic, of course.
That could be a later reason. There's another thing going on here, and it's it's really interesting to me because the more I learn about Mormon culture, the more fascinated I become with this phenomenon of forgetting. Of course, theater is all about remembering, literally taking dismembered observations and bringing them back together and presenting them on a stage. And it's interesting to me because the Latter-day Saints, as it says on the screen, are by several decades the first English-speaking religious body in America to have sanctioned theater as an activity appropriate for its parishioners to both attend and produce. 1844, as opposed to the 1880s for any other denomination.
Lee, are you sharing right now your slideshow?
I am. I'm sorry.
Okay, we're not
Is it
seeing
not?
it right now. So
Okay, here we go.
It's a
Now
screen
is
only Lee can
that's
see through his
there we
spiritual
go.
eyes. We understand that. Here we go.
okay. Okay, now this is
There we
yes, but
go.
it's not the right one. Let me find the right one. Do you see a slide or do you see my
Yeah, it
script?
says the Latter-day Saints are by several decades. I believe that's what you just
Oh,
said.
okay, very
Yep, I
oh,
think you're good.
I'm so happy. All right, we're
Yep,
good.
I think we're on track now.
Okay. Um, this is the Salt Lake Theater in Salt Lake City as it was being built in 1862.
Is that the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers Theater?
Or
No,
museum.
it doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Doesn't
okay.
exist.
There's a bank on that corner now.
Oh,
Okay. So
It
they
was
started
torn
that
down
makes
there.
sense.
it was torn down in 1928, but when it was built, it was the most splendid theater west of the Mississippi. And it was built by order of Brigham Young. And there's a reason that he was interested in theater. Um, and that reason is all the more interesting because before he became a member of the Latter-day Saints, Brigham Young, being a person who was born in the early 19th century, would not have dreamed in his wildest nightmares. He wouldn't have thought that he would be treading the boards in a theater. He certainly wouldn't have predicted that the Latter-day Saints would basically invent theater among American religious communities. The rest of religious America, English-speaking religious America, would not catch up to the innovations that the Latter-day Saints made with regard to the theater until the 1880s. So this begs the question, why is there zero curiosity in the Orthodox LDS about its own role in American history? It's weird. So I thought I would run through the facts as I've found them as a theater historian. And I need to say at the at at this point, I need to bring my background into it a little bit. I do not have a dog in this race. I do have Mormon heritage, but I didn't find out about it until I was well into my 30s. And I found out about it because I got interested in family history, and I got interested in family history through Ken Burns's Civil War documentary in the 1990s. And what I discovered is that I have three flavors of restoration theology in my background. All three sprang from the original movement in the 1830s. My relatives my ancestors were converted in Pennsylvania and in Indiana, and they went to Kirtland and they went to Far West. And one branch just stayed in Far West and did not follow Joseph Smith to Nauvoo. The second branch went in the Exodus from Nauvoo out to Salt Lake City, and the third became RLDS over the issue of polygamy. And I didn't know any of this before I became a theater historian. And naturally, when I found out about this, and I thought, oh, I'll go to Nauvoo, Illinois, and see what's shaking. And Landon, Rebecca, have you been to Nauvoo?
I have.
Landon has,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Very. Uh, do you remember a three-story building? We're about to see a picture of it a little later on, but a three-story building that's called the Cultural Hall.
Yep, the Cultural Hall. Yep.
Okay. Now it's called the Cultural Hall.
Every church has a cultural hall, so you really
Every
notice the cultural hall when you go to Nauvoo.
Yeah, yeah. Well, originally, when it was built, when it was dedicated on April 6th, it had another name, and it had that other name uh, the entire time that the Latter-day Saints were in Nauvoo, and that other name was called the Masonic Hall.
Mm.
That
And
tracks.
yes, yes, and so when I entered the cultural hall, I was not expecting to see a theatrical poster in there, and I saw the theatrical poster, and it said Masonic Hall, uh, grand moral entertainment to defray the legal expenses of Joseph Smith.
Oh.
And I there were a couple of lovely sisters there minding the room, and there was no one else there. Came very early in the season, before the big rush for the pageant. And I said, there were plays in here. And they said, yes, yeah, there were plays in here in the cultural hall. And I said, why does the poster say Masonic Hall? And they said, well, it's the cultural hall. And I said, yes, but the poster says Masonic Hall. Yes, but this is the cultural hall. I said, was it called the cultural hall in 1844 when this poster is from? And they said, I think it's always been called the cultural hall. So I had my work cut out for me. What I
Yeah.
discovered was that no, it wasn't always called the Cultural Hall. It was, in fact, the Masonic Hall, and it had always been the Masonic Hall, and it became the Cultural Hall much, much later when Nauvoo Restoration Incorporated took the place over. So it was a conflation of what had happened in Utah and the tradition of cultural halls, and it was a reading back into history of that particular movement. But
It was actually an erasing of history because they don't want you to know that Joseph Smith was involved in masonry and that's where a lot of the temple things come from, is from the Masons. So that's why they would have named it the Cultural Hall.
Just
oh
like
boy,
now
do we have a
they're
lot to talk about.
we do,
But
just like now how they're retrofitting the Salt Lake Temple, which used to be covered in its architectural elements with Masonic elements and symbols, the
yes,
sun, the moon, the stars. They pretty much scraped all that. Those don't exist anymore. And they're making it very whitewashed just to kind of destroy that heritage that a lot of people don't even realize is there. But those of us that do, it's kind of disappointing.
that's very interesting. Interesting how this happens.
Yeah.
So well, on the one hand, we have the cultural hall slash Masonic hall, and that's where the first Latter-day Saint productions took place. In that, Landon, if you remember, it's a very tiny room. It has to seat fewer than 200 people, maybe 150. And it was nothing like um, this grand theater that was built. Brigham Young's Salt Lake Theater was the most splendid venue west of the Mississippi when it was built in 1862. Every major theatrical star in America played there through the 1880s, and its mostly Latter-day Saint company brought forth not only the mogul of melodrama, to whom I'll introduce you in a few minutes, but also Maude Adams, the highest paid actress of her day, and the very first to play Peter Pan on Broadway in 1904. The
Wow.
origin, yeah, she was quite the international star before the advent of films. And the origin of the dramatic spark among the Latter-day Saints can be found in the sheer theatricality of this place in New York that was called the Burned Over District. It's a part of New York State that was scorched by the fire and brimstone revivalism of the Second Great Awakening. And chief architect of the kind of tent meetings that gave the region its nickname was the future founder of Oberlin College, Charles Grandison Finney, 1792 to 1875. Finney was the de facto dean of public performance in the service of proselytizing. He was a highly pragmatic theologian. He sought to present Christianity to the masses in an engaging manner. And the religious enthusiasm of the revival meeting was, Finney wrote, not a miracle or a miracle or dependent on a miracle in any sense. Rather, revival was a purely philosophical result of the right use of the appropriate means. Ministers, Finney insisted, ought to know what measures are best calculated to aid in accomplishing the great end of their office, the salvation of souls. The object, Finney concluded, was to get up an excitement and bring the people out. So I'd like to introduce you to a cast of characters who, in Finney's words, brought out and in turn brought out many after them. Some you may have heard of before, but perhaps not in the theatrical limelight under which we're about to examine them. They are Amasa Lyman. You familiar with that name?
I have. Was he an apostle?
He was. He was a
until
member
he
of,
wasn't, because he
Until he
was
wasn't.
Godbeite.
That's right.
Until he wasn't, and
He
that
was an actor. That's why he wasn't.
that was a story. That was a story.
He was a Godbeite.
He was a member of Joseph Smith's Council of 12 and the advisory group of the First Presidency. George A. Smith, Joseph Smith's first cousin, also a 12 and First Presidency member, later the first official historian of the Latter-day Saints, and the redactor of Joseph Smith's journals into what we now know as the history of the church. Heber C. Kimball, a member of the Council of 12 and Council of 50 in Nauvoo, and first counselor to Brigham Young, who later appointed him governor of the Provisional State of Deseret and a Utah territorial legislator at the end of his life. Brigham Young himself, with whom you are perhaps passingly familiar. Hiram B. Clausen, a jack of all trades, architect, stonemason, businessman, master of debate, actor, and close associate of Brigham Young. In fact, Clausen became Young's son-in-law. He took 2 of Young's daughters as his last plural wives, and consequently spent time in a Utah prison for bigamy after statehood. Clausen was also the first manager of the Salt Lake Theater, more about which later. In addition, we have Jared W. Carter Sr., a counselor close enough to Joseph Smith to have been mentioned in several of the prophecies found in the Doctrine and Covenants and believed to have been one of the architects of the vigilante group known as the Danites. The elder Carter was repeatedly in and out of favor with the prophet until the assassination, upon which he became a Strangite for a time, but returned quietly to the Brighamites for a few years before his death in 1849 in Illinois. His son, Jared W. Carter Jr., who became an itinerant actor. Harry Cogswell, first married to actor Thomas A. Line, then in an extremely awkward turn of events, leaving Line for Jared Carter in 1862. And their son, Lincoln Jared Carter, the spectacularly successful actor, playwright, theatrical manager, producer, and inventor of patented theatrical effects, some of which are still in use today. Lincoln J. Carter, who became known as king of the melodrama until the introduction of the cinema, all but erased his brilliant career. And now, to our present subject, all 10 of these colorful characters had in common their time in the fiery crucible of the burned-over district in New York. Hiram Clausen was born in Utica in 1826. Jared Carter Sr. was baptized into the Latter-day Saints in Colesville in 1832. Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball were baptized the next year on the same day at the same meeting in Mendon. George A. Smith was baptized a Latter-day Saint the next year in Potsdam. Amasa Lyman, baptized by an LDS minister that same year in New Hampshire, then rushing westward to Pennsylvania, eventually catching up to them in Kirtland, Ohio. Carrie Cogswell, a young actress whose family had migrated from Nantucket to Boston to Buffalo, and who would return to the Niagara area at the end of her life. And later, once she was married to Jared Carter Jr., Carrie was staying with her sister in Rochester when she gave birth to their son Lincoln on April 15th, 1865, which should give us some clue as to why he was named Lincoln. But the character to whom I'd like to draw particular attention is a prominent tragedian, at least in his time he was prominent, named Thomas Ackley Line, 1806 to 1890. Career lasted from 1829 to 1885. He toured as a performer through the burned-over district, and after his involvement with the Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo, for over 30 years, I have been researching Line's life and career. He shared the stage with most of the 19th century's most renowned theatrical personalities, including Junius Brutus Booth, who was the father of Lincoln's assassin and one of the most famous actors of his time, Charlotte Cushman, Edwin Forrest, and William Charles McCready. At the time of his death in 1890, T.A. Line was acknowledged as the oldest actor in America by a theatrical press that kept careful track of such things. So, here's where the lack of curiosity comes in. According to a biographical sketch on a web page, which was up until 2019 entitled Mormon Pioneer Overland Travel, Thomas A. Line was a professional actor who performed in Nauvoo, Illinois, after converting to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But, and I've underlined this in red, little is known about him until 1862. Now, the goal of my research has been very simple, to rewrite that entry. And, well, I have to say, so far, so good. When I presented my work at a conference in 2019, the person in charge of that database was in the audience. And much to their credit, they updated the entry. And now it looks like this.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
You've done
Excellent.
good.
Yeah, that's right.
I can be done as far as I'm concerned, but I do have more energy and more interest to devote to this. It's very difficult to move the needle on something like a historical record, but it's the perplexing thing about this is that it's never been the case that little has been known of this man. We just haven't been looking in the right place, or more accurately, no one's been looking. All of the information has always been there. It's just that no one was looking. My work, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I think that may have to do with that last sentence there of that last paragraph where it says his tenure at Salt Lake City Theater was cut short by a long and public feud with Brigham Young. Exactly. When you cross the prophet in Utah, little is known of you after that.
That's right. It's over.
Just wait until you hear the way he crossed him.
Okay.
We can't wait.
I've been looking at lines at the sweep of his life from his birth all the way to his death. And particularly from his birth until 1862, because after that, it's fairly well documented. Although the most interesting parts of it have been pretty systematically forgotten. There's a lot to add because the sentence "little is known about him until 1862," it's just not true. Never has been. I've recently learned that people who have doubts about the Mormon faith in which they were raised are sometimes referred to as lazy learners. Have you heard that term
Oh, yeah.
before?
Oh,
We've
we've
been called
personally
that
been
term,
called
yes.
lazy learners.
Okay, well, I think that can be flipped a little bit here, because I'm relatively sure that what we're dealing with here is lazy learning, as far as it goes to what we're not curious about. As it happens, there's a lot to know about Thomas A. Line before 1862, and this is what I've discovered in the last 3 decades. We'll just wait for it to trickle down here for a while, shall we?
It's always the way with information. There's a trickle down period before you
Mhm.
access it.
Yes, well, someone named Rebecca Biblioteca would know that, wouldn't
Yeah.
Well, that is a look,
Here,
not very much, isn't it?
yeah.
Wow.
And the more deeply one looks at Line's life, the more one is astounded at the breadth of his travel, at his stamina, as someone who made several major life changes, including a conversion to the Latter-day Saints, a wholehearted throwing everything he had into being a member of the Latter-day Saint community, including being in the entourage of Joseph Smith. And then after the assassination, lots of stuff happened, and we will get into that. But in point of fact, during the last 6 weeks of Joseph Smith's life, Thomas A. Line was as far into the inner circle as one could be, having only been a baptized Mormon for 6 weeks. And why then, if he was so close with so many prominent people, why did the name of Thomas A. Line fade so abruptly from the historical consciousness of the Latter-day Saints? And the answer lies in the period historians now call the succession crisis. And that was the power struggle created by the brutal lynching of Joseph and Hyrum Smith. As we know, one of Brigham Young's challengers, here we have the poster. Do you see the poster, Masonic Hall?
Yeah.
Okay. Grand Moral Entertainment. Notice that it's called a Grand Moral Entertainment and not a play. It's very, very important. The cast here is kind of a who's who of who was in power in Nauvoo at the time. Notice that the first person listed on the cast list under Peruvians, Ataliba, the king of Quito, was played by Mr. J. Hatch. This is Orrin Hatch's great-grandfather. Tom Line is Rolla, the high priest. This is Erastus Snow. G.A. Smith. This B. Young, the high priest, is Brigham Young. And down here we have several other people. Amasa Lyman is down here. This is Heber C. Kimball. And Mrs. Young played Elvira. So
all
during
in
the succession, all in that one play, and there is a much longer conversation to be had, maybe that we could have in the future, just about that little troupe of players. Because, as I've said before, no one in their wildest imaginings would have thought that they would ever get up on a stage in front of people, because it wasn't something that one did at the time. But they were persuaded by the fact that Joseph Smith liked a play or two. He liked to go to the theater, and he thought that would probably be a good thing to be involved in. And so Brigham Young, yes, was in a play. He was directed by Tom Line, and it was a non-speaking role, by the way. I would imagine because Brigham Young was way too busy to come to rehearsals. They just told him where to stand. And he played a priest that cast fire during a ritual.
So hard to picture.
Yes. Well, it's There's an anecdote in a book called The Mormons in the Theater by John S. Lindsay, who was an actor who worked with Line. It was published in 1905 toward the end of Lindsay's life. And he recalls having interviewed Line for the book about 20 years beforehand. Line died in 1890. And he said, during the interview, Mr. Line broke out in a humorous vein and remarked, John, I've always regretted casting Brigham Young in the part of the high priest. And Lindsay responded, well, why is that? And Line said, because don't you see, John, he's been playing the part ever since.
I
That
was going to
is
say
more accurate.
he cast him
Yes.
perfectly. No one throws fire and brimstone like Brigham Young.
That's right.
Even more to the point, what I've discovered is that there's even more to the humor of that situation. Both John S. Lindsay and Thomas A. Line allied themselves with the Godbeites in the 1870s, and they both became members of the spiritualist movement. Does the name Amos Lyman ring a bell?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was the apostle that became the Godbeite.
Yeah.
Wasn't he excommunicated? I think so.
I think we lost Lee.
Did we lose Lee? That's too bad. I was going to say it's such an unknown part of history. I mean, I've never heard anything about any of the founding fathers of Mormonism being involved in the theater at all. And I mean, look at the DNC. There's so many other things in there that are just the minutia detail, build me a house, dig me a treasure. It never said go be in a theatrical production to make money so that Joseph Smith can get out of jail.
Get out of jail.
Get out of jail. It's just such a funny, it's just so unexpected. And I can see why it wouldn't be necessarily really known. You know what I mean? It has that sense of, the weight of being a prophet. This is something completely different. So
no. There he is.
Hi there.
Yeah.
I'm back. No sooner do you begin talking about Brigham Young than all heck breaks
hell breaks
hell
loose.
breaks
Yeah,
loose.
it happens
That's
every
exactly
time.
right.
Where did you lose me?
You froze up. If you want to go back to the slide that you had.
Godbeites. You said, do you know who Elizabeth Lyman was? And we said, yeah, he was an apostle that joined the Godbeites.
Who joined the Godbeites. Exactly. Yeah. Okay, here we go. And you see Tom and Brigham Young there.
No, we don't see slides yet.
You're not sharing.
You're not sharing just yet, huh?
Yeah,
okay.
There we go.
There we go. Yep.
All righty.
Let me adjust the screen just a second here because I don't want us out of order from how we were. I think I got us back. Otherwise, you'll shift all of a sudden when I cut it back in.
Like,
I understand.
Okay, so we just talked about the Godbeites.
Right.
We carried on just in case you came back, and we talked a little bit about Brigham Young and how it was strange that they'd be an actor.
Right, and how no one knows anything about that. Nothing.
Right.
It's erased from history.
Right. It's mentioned every once in a while, and it's usually mentioned as part of a myth that has developed in Mormon historical lore. And that myth is that theater was actually introduced to the Latter-day Saints by Joseph Smith. And that he had this idea to form a theatrical troupe. And that's the reason that he called Tom Line from Philadelphia to come out to Nauvoo, and that the whole thing had been his idea, which is absolutely, there is not a shred of evidence to support that, but it's repeated again and again and again in any study that purports to look to the origins of Mormon theater. That's just not the way professional theater worked in the 1840s. We will get to that in about 10 minutes, I think.
Okay.
So here we are in the succession crisis. You remember the succession crisis, don't you?
Yes.
So one of Brigham Young's challengers during the summer of 1844, after the martyrdom of Joseph and Hyrum Smith, was the man whom the prophet had chosen as his vice presidential running mate in the abandoned election campaign of 1844, and that was Sidney Rigdon. And I will give you one guess as to whom Thomas A. Line supported in the succession crisis.
I'm going with Sidney.
You are correct, sir.
There he is.
There he is. That was it was a spectacular political miscalculation. The short version of a very long story is that Line became a Rigdonite evangelist and then an elder on Rigdon's council that met at Adventure Farm in Greencastle, Pennsylvania. But Rigdon's movement imploded by mid-1846, and that is how LDS encyclopedias came to say little is known about T.A. Line before 1862. Now, I will admit that I have not yet completely convinced myself whether Brigham Young took complete notice of the fact that Line had jumped ship and had become a Rigdonite. It's entirely possible that Young had more on his mind than trying to track down Tom Line, because Young did hire him again about 18 years later to work for his theatrical company in Salt Lake City. But we will get to that. It's problematic that Line has been forgotten because the result has assigned credit for significant events to the wrong people. And that wrong assignment of credit has ossified into a legend that it was Joseph Smith himself who organized a theater troupe in Nauvoo in 1844. My research bears out that this narrative, however, did not even emerge until 1904, 60 years after the events in question. Even so, that fallacy persists not only in popular Mormon writing, but also in modern theses, dissertations, and scholarly studies. It was even asserted as late as 2016 in a major historical work about Mormons during the Civil War. Now, research that I've conducted since 1993 leads me to the following conclusions. First, T.A. Line, not Joseph Smith, introduced the practice of professional theater to the Latter-day Saints. And this was common knowledge both before and after 1862. Historian Edward Tullidge put it this way in 1886. The Mormon theater was conceived in Nauvoo in Joseph's day. It is as orthodox as the temple. Thomas A. Line was Joseph's actor, which is why that's going to be the name of the biography that I'm writing about Thomas A. Line, Joseph's actor.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, me too. I'm kind of fond of it myself. Ironically enough, although he himself bitterly opposed the institution and hierarchy of the LDS for the last quarter century of his life, Line's theatrical direction and elocutionary instruction of these church officials in turn influenced the execution of the very first temple endowment ritual held in the Nauvoo temple in the winter of 1845 and 1846. Let me show you how. Consider the following 6 men. We've got Clawson, Young, Smith, Kimball, and Snow. 5 of them were members of Joseph Smith's Council of 12, the most powerful men in Nauvoo after the prophet himself. All 6 were members of the Lutz collection of amateurs whom Line gathered around him to perform plays in May and June 1844, one of which was a benefit for Joseph Smith's legal defense fund. And here's an interesting confluence, which, to my knowledge, has not been considered before now. All six took part in the earliest temple endowment ceremony in Nauvoo. Hiram Clausen received his endowment in February of 1846. Young, Lyman, Smith, Kimball, and Snow all, wait for it, they all assumed dramatic roles in that original version of the ritual in 1845. Now, there is nothing in this that should offend even the most orthodox LDS members. It's a clear matter of historical fact. The various roles documented in the journals of participants William Clayton, Amasa Lyman, Heber C. Kimball, and others. You can go out and get these books. You can get them on Kindle, for heaven's sake. You can read the journals and you can see when each of these roles were taken by which person. That part was not secret or sacrosanct. Now, Jonathan Stapley noted in 2018 that in the months leading up to his assassination, Joseph Smith had begun sublimating written revelation in favor of his living oracle. Instead of a systematic written liturgy, Smith introduced ritual concepts, and people learned to participate in them through proximate example and oral instruction. Each ritual was thus performative in the sense that church members and leaders learned it together. End quote. When the succession crisis had been resolved, Brigham Young picked up where Smith had left off, formalizing the endowment ceremony as it commenced in the uncompleted Nauvoo Temple in the winter of 1845 and 46, building on Joseph Smith's model of ritual through performative example. Yet, as we ponder the fact that Young, Kimball, George A. Smith, Lyman, and Snow rehearsed the dramatic sketch at the heart of the temple endowment that winter, and as Hiram Clausen received his endowment in that same ceremony the following February, let's ponder also this question. Whose lessons were they remembering as they learned the endowment together, as they refined it into a repeatable ceremony? Before coming to Nauvoo, none of these men from the burned-over district in New York would have remotely entertained the idea of receiving dramatic training. The social risk would have been too great. Who had, in the spring of 1844, given them their 6-week crash course in how to stand, how to transition from one scene into the next, how to adapt and convert an empty room into a theatrical space, how to move as individuals and as a group, how to articulate and to enunciate and project their spoken roles? The acting coach and elocutionist in absentia of the original temple endowment ceremony in Nauvoo was Thomas A. Line, tragedian. In the winter of 1845-46, then, Line's work as a stage director was woven into the very fabric of Mormon temple practice. Now, to say that this is significant is an understatement. As Stapley writes, the Nauvoo temple introduced a radically expanded cosmology, and the entirety of Mormonism realigned itself to accommodate. The ironies here.
This is really ironic because the actors went from the Masonic hall to the temple, and the ceremony basically went from the Masonic hall to the temple.
That is exactly right. All of these men, except for Line, were members of the Masonic Lodge.
And I think the bottom line is it's always been a show.
There's something performative about every religion. There's something inherently performative about the roots of Mormonism. Because once again, it It was conceived in the burned over district, camp revival meetings, public displays of religion, and in the monologue that became the Book of Mormon as well. And that's a whole nother evening of talk as well. But each of these folks, well, none of them, not one of the performers in that original temple endowment, not Brigham Young, not George A. Smith, not Heber C. Kimball, not Amasa Lyman, not Erastus Snow, or any of the others whom Line had coached, ever acknowledged the fact of Line's influence as they rehearsed and executed the new temple endowment. Because the endowment was a secret ceremony, Line would forever be utterly unaware that he had a hand in shaping the performative liturgy of a new American religion. And although in 1844, Line had directed the new leader of that religion on stage, who within 2 decades was to establish the grandest theatrical venue west of the Rockies, the two would spend the last active decades of their lives in a very public dispute with one another in a setting neither one of them could have imagined. Once the Brighamites had established themselves in Salt Lake City, Brigham Young himself commissioned the building of the most impressive theatrical venue west of the Mississippi, Salt Lake Theater. Whom did Young select to manage the theater? He selected Hiram Clausen, the young actor whom Thomas A. Line had drafted into his original company 18 and a half years before in Nauvoo. Now, in December of 1862, when the theater had just been built, Line was down on his luck. He was stranded in Denver, Colorado Territory. He had 2 small children in his care, and his third wife, Carrie, was on a tour of Rocky Mountain towns in a company with Jared W. Carter Jr. Line was well aware that Carrie was about to leave him for Carter, and another actor tipped Line off about the opening of the Salt Lake Theater. And Line kind of bit the inside of his cheek and wrote a letter to Brigham Young, preserved among Young's papers, requesting employment. However Young may have balked at employing Line, Hiram Clausen, who was now Young's son-in-law twice over, and the Salt Lake Theater manager, convinced him to give Line a chance. And Line acted as elocution coach to the company and appeared in all his classic roles there until the rift between him and Young became insurmountable. He opposed Young's authority to the end of his long life in Salt Lake City, and he outlived Young by 13 years, almost out of sheer spite. But wait, there are even deeper layers of the situation to explore. We have noted that Carrie Cogwell was to leave Line in 1863 to become the new Mrs. Carter. Let's double back to Nauvoo, Illinois, in the spring of 1844, when Line was in the entourage of Joseph Smith and performing at the Masonic Hall. The Masonic Hall is up here. It's actually 3 blocks up in the upper left-hand corner. And Line is staying at the City Hotel. The building is still standing. It's a private residence. But at the time, it was called the City Hotel. He was housed in that building in Old Nauvoo that served as a hotel under several names. City Hotel was the most common of them. And during the first week of April 1844, he was baptized a Latter-day Saint by Amasa Lyman. Down the next block were his neighbors, Sidney Rigdon, who ran the Nauvoo post office out of his home for a time, and Joseph and Emma Smith's mansion house, part of which also stands in Old Nauvoo as a part of the Community of Christ's historic homestead. Now, in April of 1844, upon arriving in Nauvoo, Line had immediately divorced his first wife, who had no intention of becoming a Mormon. Her name was Mercy Adams. He divorced her in absentia. And circumstances and later events lead us to the conclusion that because Line was eager to become a Latter-day Saint, and because Mercy apparently refused to leave New York City to join him, that Emerson Lyman had assured Line that a divorce was not only acceptable, but necessary. And they even had a second wife in mind for him. And that was the daughter of the recently transplanted LDS High Priest of Philadelphia, Peter Hess, and his wife, Marianne Harlan Hess, whom Line immediately set about courting. And here we discover a startling irony that becomes apparent only once we trace Line's steps past the Rigdon home, turning westward at Joseph and Emma Smith's mansion house, and then southward onto Partridge Street to arrive at the house the Hesses had rented. Now, why do I call this ironic? Because each time Line visited Marianne between the months of April and June of 1844, he passed the house of Jared Carter Sr., and the remains of the basement of that house can still be seen in Old Nauvoo. They're fenced off and they're unlabeled. There's no historical sign there, but it is the basement of Jared W. Carter Sr.'s house. And who was likely to have been playing in the yard of that house on any given sunny day? 6-year-old Jared Carter Jr., who was to run away with Line's third wife some 18 years later. And 2 years after that, while staying at Carrie's sister's home in Rochester, where Jared Jr. was starring, would welcome Lincoln Jared Carter into the world. But the ironies do not stop there. Marianne Hess had a little brother named Cortland, who, like Jared Carter Jr., was also 6 years old in the spring of 1844. And he and little Jared lived 1 block from each other in Nauvoo, while Line was courting Cortland's sister, Marianne. Both Jared and Cortland were youngest sons of very prominent and very powerful Latter-day Saints. Each may have even seen Line perform on stage at the Masonic Hall in May 1844, but this is what is truly astonishing. Both of these boys grew up to be professional actors. And we need to understand the significance of that fact. No parents of children in any religious community born in 1838 would have blessed their decision to go on the stage. The population of professional actors in all of the America of the 1860s was not even in the thousands, but in the mere hundreds. Yet 2 boys who spent a few weeks in their childhoods watching the actor Tom Line walk back and forth between the City Hotel and the Hess property to woo Cortland's sister, back and forth past the Carter house. Both of these boys grew up to be professional actors. Cortland, for his part, clearly grew up idealizing his brother-in-law, Line, and years later, after Marianne died suddenly in 1852, and Line had remarried Carrie, Jared Jr.'s reunion with Line was less affectionate. But Line had, by then, influenced not only the Temple Endowment, but 2 actors who had their own roles to play in American theater history on April 15th, 1865. On that day, Cortland Van Rensselaer Hess was giving depositions to police in Washington, D.C., because he was a member of the company of actors at Ford's Theater. And he had witnessed the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And Jared Carter Jr. was welcoming his first son into the world with his wife, Carrie, a son they named Lincoln Jared Carter when news of the assassination reached them. Lincoln later related the grim family joke told to him by his mother, Carrie: "The day you were born, the whole country mourned." But
They had a sense of humor, but
had
I
a
can
sense of
see
humor, they did.
that. Wow.
And Lincoln J. Carter, born in Rochester, New York, in the heart of the old burned over district, went on to become the most successful of them all. He got his start in theater as a call boy at the old Salt Lake Theater that had started under Clausen's management. He lived in Salt Lake City as a young boy while still performing there, and was personally acquainted with Brigham Young, half-brother to Lyne's two children with Carrie Carter, his mother, holder of dozens of patents on stage effect machinery, the first stage director in America to use moving pictures, films in his productions. He was known as the king of melodrama from his first success, The Fast Mail, in 1892, through his commercial dominance of the Chicago stage, success in New York, and several simultaneous touring companies of a dozen subsequent plays. In sum, Lincoln J. Carter was by far the most famous and successful of any theater practitioner with an LDS background before the advent of cinema. And that is neither the end nor the most interesting part of his story, but it is a story for another time. And we want to leave plenty of time for further dialogue. Lincoln J. Carter and the rest of his forerunners in the Latter-day Saints from the burned over district reshaped the American stage and American religious history, and it is high time that they got their due.
That's quite interesting. I had no idea that Mormonism had such ties. Obviously, growing up, those of us who grew up in my era, you had Saturday's Warrior, you had My Turn on Earth,
Yes.
you had those plays. But road shows was always a big part of it. BYU always had a big theater program. There were all the pageants. But they seemed to be kind of a Mormon thing. I had no idea that so much had come out of Mormonism to the other world. I think when we were talking, you had said that to be an actor prior to that time was to go to a theater was the equivalent of going to a strip club.
Yes, exactly. That is a perfect analogy for the visceral reaction that the stage evoked in people in the 1840s. They just did not believe that decent people would present themselves on the stage that way. As a matter of fact, when Tom Lyne debuted as an actor in 1829, he knew very well what every young man who wanted to become an actor, and a young woman who wanted to become an actor knew. And that was that once you set foot on a stage, you automatically came under moral suspicion. You were rendered unfit for any other line of work. And that attitude persisted for about 40 years. As late as the 1880s, an actor with whom Lyne had worked, named George Holland, was refused Christian burial because he was an actor. It depended on your denomination, of course, but there was a long anti-theatrical tradition in American attitudes, and it wasn't until the advent of what we call the Little Theater movement in the late 1890s and the early 1910s. The Little Theater movement was the movement that brought theater to neighborhoods rather than the professional stage.
If I recall my reading right, didn't Huckleberry Finn and go to a theater when he in the book, and it was like it's kind of everyone shooting and drunk and everything like that. It was
Yes.
described pretty much just like that.
The Frontier Theater was mayhem. There was a genteel feel to the theaters in the urban centers, such as New York. But all that came to a screeching halt in 1849, in May of 1849, during something called the Astor Place riots, in which Edwin Forrest, an American, and William Charles McCready, a Brit, who had both worked with Tom Line, by the way. He worked with both of them. Edwin Forrest was actually born in Philadelphia in the same year. They had worked rather closely together, and he had shared the stage with both of them by that time in his career. In 1849, it was sort of like football or rugby hooligans who took the sides of their favorite tragedian. And Edwin Forrest was doing the same roles as McCready, and they were at competing theaters. And there was a riot between the supporters of Edwin Forrest and the supporters of McCready, and people died. They had to bring in the militia, and the militia fired into the crowd and killed people. And that put a psychic scar in the theater going public in America, to the point where there was a class divide. There was uptown, and then there was downtown. There was uptown and the opera house and the respectable theaters and Shakespeare, and then there was downtown, and there was Shakespeare there too, but it was considerably more bawdy. And there was blood and gore and women, heaven forbid, showing their legs. And no respectable person, certainly no religious person, would be seen in a theater, would have anything to do with it. Which is why it's really noteworthy that both Jared Carter Jr. and Cortland Van Rensselaer Hess grew up to become actors. I think that Line's influence had a profound effect on the direction they both chose to go.
That makes sense, because they probably wouldn't have found it on their own without being exposed to someone like that. So it makes
Absolutely
sense to
not.
me, though, because I kind of think about the early church. It was a show. I mean, I said that facetiously before, but a lot of Joseph Smith's early activities were a show as far as treasure digging and magic. And then you add in the Masonic element, which is very performative, a narrative that you act out as you go from level to level. And it just makes sense to me that eventually that all ended up baked into Mormonism, because all the parts of Mormonism are borrowed by, what was in the air of that era. So, and I'm trying to picture what it would be like. What do you think, Landon, if we went to the temple, it was a live session, and there were the current apostles dressed up in costumes? I mean, that is what was happening back then. That's so funny to me.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
Who would play whom? What do you think, Landon?
I don't know. They were also old. At this point,
well,
they wouldn't be able to do much
who would be
acting.
the snake? Who would be the snake?
Who would be
That's
the
the
snake?
question.
Yes.
Yeah, they were all strapping young men in their 30s and early 40s at that time.
Yeah, people forget that about the early church. They were youngins. They were young kids just going, hey, this looks fun. Let's see if we can make a religious component so it's okay to do, right? Whether
Hey,
that's
kids,
marry
let's
a
put
lot
on
of
a
women.
faith.
Yeah, exactly. No,
Now,
we forget.
Was it common for men to dress up as women in the theater? And we all know the story of Brigham Young's son,
Yes.
Madame Petrino, is that?
Patarini.
Patarini,
Yes,
yes.
Patarini.
Yes. Yeah. Female impersonation was a specialty. It was not terribly widespread, but it could be looked upon as acceptable if someone was traveling as a female impersonator or as a male impersonator. Now, of course, we have a very different take on performers in the 19th century who chose to, in 21st century parlance, who chose to dress in drag. And I would commend everyone to the incredible work of Conal O'Donovan, who has done amazing primary research in that area in Mormon history, Madame Paterini included.
How the roles have flipped. It used to be
Yeah.
that the actors were like going to a strip club and no respectable person would be caught there. Now everybody goes to the theater, and it's almost like if you go to a drag show, and that's changing just recently, but in the
Yes.
last 20 years, if you went to a drag show, it would have been like going to the theater
Right.
back
You
in
were on
the
the fringe.
1800s. Yeah.
Yeah. Theater is in absolutely no danger of dying. Some people say that it is, but it's not dying. It's doing what it's always done. It's morphing into different genres and finding their own niches within those genres. And that's one of the fascinating things about it. Back to the point of presentation, Fawn Brodie wrote in No Man Knows My History that Joseph Smith seldom seldom spoke a word or performed an act without an audience in mind. He always had the person to whom, or the people to whom, he wanted a message to get across. Always had that in mind. He was a natural performer, and I cast no aspersions whatsoever with that label. It does not necessarily, we needn't infer that performers are hypocrites.
Right.
Although the literal meaning, the Greek meaning of the word hypocrite, hypokrite, is actor.
I didn't know that. Is that true? How interesting.
Fun fact, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can understand Joseph Smith a little more if you look at him like that. Someone that was always on stage, someone that was always performing in whatever given circumstance, trying to achieve his ends, which we don't always understand what those were, but exactly. And like you said, monologuing a lot of the time, a lot of the things that he was doing that you wouldn't think were a performance or a monologue, they were. And I think he had that capability, probably incredible memory. Have you looked at that? I mean, just as actors do with their devices. I mean, it's so fascinating.
I'm convinced that Joseph Smith had an eidetic memory, photographic, we call it now.
Interesting.
That he could memorize long passages, not only of scripture, but of anything he set his mind to. And it is simply a fact from every bit of data that we have, everything that's ever been written about Joseph Smith. He was a flaming extrovert. He was absolutely extroverted. He got his energy from other people, and particularly with crowds of people. And a lot of his performative charisma comes out in the accounts of his speaking. And it was contagious. It was infectious to the people around him. Everybody wanted to be more eloquent because in the way in which Joseph Smith had been eloquent. And I think that's one of the reasons that he was attracted to line, and he's recorded in the history of the church as having had two conversations with Line. They were both very brief. One of them, I had to do a lot of digging to figure out the context for this conversation that he had with him. But in George Smith's redaction of the conversation that they had on May 11th, 1844, it's a long paragraph about had a conversation with Mr. Line about the nature of the theater and blah, blah, blah. Well, the actual, if you dig enough and you go back to the original journal entry that Smith had dictated or that Smith had written himself, I don't know if it was Willard Richards or if it was himself who had done it. The line says, "Conversation with Lines about theater," Lines. That's all it says.
And no one would understand what that meant. No one would know that was a person and what that might have been about.
Yeah, except that the plays were rehearsing in the Masonic Hall. Where was the city council meeting held that day? In the Masonic Hall.
Okay.
Had they had a meeting? They had not had a meeting because they didn't have a quorum. So Joseph Smith had shown up in the Masonic Hall. The actors were waiting to rehearse. Tom Line was there. Of course, Line went over and reintroduced himself. And they had a little chat about theater. Line probably said, "You know that I'm taking a troupe up and down the Mississippi now to perform the plays that we performed for you." And he probably said, "Oh, that's okay." What he did not allow Line to do was take his counselors
Right.
as cast members. And so there's
And
a
he
whole
wanted to, right? They were so good. He wanted
he
them to go
he
along.
actually wanted them to come. Although
History would be different.
how good they were is a kind of a matter of debate. Not all of them could remember their lines.
Oh.
And Helen Mar Kimball, who became Helen Mar Kimball Whitney, and wrote a piece in the Women's Exponent about being in the company. She was one of the actors. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, almost anyone, she was also one of the plural wives of Joseph Smith at the age of 16. But no one around him knew it. Line didn't know it. He believed to the end of his life that Joseph Smith had not been a polygamist, or he would have known it.
Was she married to him prior to joining the theater company, or
yes.
did they meet there? Okay, so they were married then.
Yes. Well, she was living in Heber's house. She certainly wasn't living at the mansion house or anything.
Right. Of course.
Yeah. So that's a whole nother layer laid on top of this. But it just so much happened in April, May, and June of 1844, and Line was right there to see it. And when Joseph went willingly to the Carthage jail, Line was in the entourage of people who walked with him, who were with him. Some were on horseback, some were walking. At some point, about halfway down, about a mile out of Nauvoo, Joseph turned around and sent everyone else back. And Line later on, much later on, sometime in 1877, he saw Joseph Smith III on the street. Joseph Smith III made several attempts to proselytize Salt Lake City, and they recognized one another because Line had known Joseph Smith III as a boy. And Line made a point to say, "I don't believe that, I know you don't believe that your father practiced polygamy," because of course he was RLDS. He was leader of the RLDS at this time. "Don't believe that you believe that your father. I believe that you don't believe that your father practiced polygamy. I don't believe it either. And I just want you to know that before your father died, he pulled me aside and said, I want you to remember what happens here so that you can be a witness for the future to my ministry." For myself, I don't believe for a moment that Joseph pulled Line aside and gave him this special little prophecy.
It's a good story again.
It was a wonderful story for Line to tell Joseph Smith III, because by that time Line was a Godbeite and a spiritualist, and he was trying to curry favor with Joseph III, because who knows, maybe he could get him a gig somewhere.
Yeah. An actor is always looking for their next gig. I think we recognize that. So
yes.
Landon and I talk about this all the time, how the role of theater and performance in Mormonism is really where, especially when we're younger, we learn a lot about the church or about the doctrine. I think about the play My Turn on Earth, Saturday's Warrior. These things are pivotal when you're young, like 12, 13, you see those. It has a lasting, lifelong impact on how you understand the church. They really, I think the church really does use theater and the arts to further their message and their doctrine and their narrative, like paintings and pictures too. What do we know about Joseph Smith and the Golden Plates? What we saw in a picture, right? There they are on the table, exactly. That's it.
Yeah.
So we, and I'm thinking that this episode is going to air before this happens, but we're putting on a readers theater with a wonderful playwright that we know. He's a Mormon and then stepped away from Mormonism, but he directed the Hilkamora pageant for 15 years. His name is Bob
that
Lauer.
so?
Yes.
Okay.
And so he's written a couple plays. He graduated from BYU back in the 80s when I was there. And he's written a play called The Beehive State, which is about post-manifesto polygamy. And Landon and I, because we feel so strongly about theater, especially in a post-Mormon context, we're actually, this is turning into an advertisement. We're putting on a reader's theater at no cost at all. It's going to be in Provo at the Provo Town Mall in the reserve space on St. Patrick's Day, easy to remember, the 17th of March at 6 p.m. And we couldn't afford to put on a real production. You know what that takes, right? But a reader's theater is something that can, we're hoping maybe launch something in the more post or nuanced Mormon world, because we feel it's really important, just like it was in the early days of the church. I mean, I feel like a lot of the saints would have, they were exposed to this kind of narrative and performance and rhetoric, whether in the temple or outside. And I think it informed everything that happened. And it's probably why we're here today as members of the church, honestly.
Exactly.
Because our ancestors were impacted. How could you not be? It was something otherworldly, right? It wasn't something that you saw ever. It was very special.
It was transcendent.
Yes.
And that is the special power of theater.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm going to start talking like my old theater self. But
and that's okay.
Well, that's good. I'm among friends, I know.
Yes.
There's a compelling nature of theater that invites transcendence. You're stepping into a liminal space, into a space that's between one reality and another reality, and you're allowed to be there for a certain amount of time. There's a difference between entertainment and ecstasy. Entertainment is from two words, inter and tenere, meaning things that you hold inside yourself and are just about you. And then there's ecstasy. Ecstasy is ekstasis, standing outside yourself in Greek. So an ecstatic experience is something that pulls you from yourself and shows you another reality, as opposed to mere entertainment, which is just giving you more of what you already want. And I think that all of us know the difference between theater or music or any kind of performing art that is merely entertaining, or if it really gives you that it's ecstatic moment.
Or as the church calls it, makes you feel the spirit.
That very fine line.
The spirit moves.
The spirit moves. I think about, go ahead, Landon.
Oh, I was going to say, I think for usefulness for the church, it's almost, you can learn more of the doctrine from a 2-hour play than you can from years of Sunday school. Because you watch the play, you think of, Saturday's Warrior. Oh, we lived before we came to earth, and then we came, and we're all going to be a family and go after, and we got to save each other, and we got to keep each other in the family. We can't let it go. That is Mormonism right there. That's why when we leave the church, our family's all going, "No, Jimmy, come back," because we all saw it in the play.
Yeah.
And the same thing with My Turn on Earth. I'm the one who writes my own story.
We can still sing all those songs.
Yeah, we can still sing it.
Every single one.
I need repentance to erase a sentence. We know all of the words, and it becomes a part of you because you listen to it. And so the same way that it influenced us, we kind of feel like to get out of some of that, you also have to have some experiences on the other side. And that's why this readers theater that we want to do on post-Mormon polygamy makes you think, what was it like once the polygamy was over? It didn't just end. It didn't just, we wrote a letter and it ended. That impacted families greatly. And what did following the Lord do? in the end, what was that experience like? And that's what we like to show. And of course, anyone can say Book of Mormon the musical. That's a completely different way to look at Mormonism, and it has a completely different change.
And that influences how the world sees Mormons.
Yeah,
I mean, honestly,
sure.
a lot of the only thing people know about Mormonism is from Book of Mormon the musical. That's how powerful it is. And I keep thinking about the early church and just how otherworldly, like you said, transcendent, going into the temple and being a part of that ceremony must have been. I don't think we have that today, because now you can turn on your TV and you can be transported, otherworldly.
Yeah.
But back in the day, especially with live sessions, it must have just been out of reality. You really must have just felt something that was incredible. Now it's a slideshow. It's not even a movie when you go in the temple. So
That's what I understand.
it's down. Well, and they do that so they can change it very quickly. Like just recently, one of the actors that played Satan, because it's like a passion play, has left the church. So of course they have to replace him. Well, that's a problem if it's a movie, but if it's a slideshow, you can, manipulate, change his face, or you can just kind of switch the slides. So I think they've done it to be a little more agile. There was a complaint a couple years ago that there wasn't enough, Jesus mentioned in the temple ceremony. So what do? You fix the slideshow. You put a couple slides of Jesus in there, and it's very easy to pivot, I guess. So
yeah. Pivoting is important.
Pivoting is important.
And I invite us to just something that you said about the live experience, and what it must have been, how powerful it must have been in the 19th century. It's instructive just to place yourself in a world in which seeing a moving human being, or hearing music, or even hearing somebody's voice has a completely different meaning for the 19th century mind than it does for the 21st century mind. Because before reproducible sound, broadcastable sound, reproducible image, reproducible music, before any of that, the mere fact that you hear a human voice or see a human being or hear music has only one meaning, and that meaning is there's a human being there within earshot. So think of people who never heard music unless there was some music being played live for them, or unless they learned to play an instrument, and spending a whole life in that mode in which your senses are hungry to pull in music or speech or poetry or a dramatic presentation. That's where the power lay at the time that the Latter-day Saints discovered professional theater. That's where the power lay. And they used it to good advantage until everybody else caught on later on in the century.
No, and that explains the burned over district too. And you're right.
Yes.
When you're just hungry for that and you're void of a lot of things, and you go to a revival and hear someone just charismatic and, preaching and exhorting, of course you're going to be overwhelmed by that. It's like your senses are just so pure. Now, whatever, we hear music every time we turn around. We see a billboard that's moving. We're very jaded as far as the purity of things like that. But then those things were very rare and special experiences. And I think about Masonry. I'm guessing you probably know a lot about that, but that was so performative too, and you would spend years memorizing these ceremonies as you pretend to be a character going through these steps to, go to the next level of Masonry. I mean, that's incredible too, what they were doing there. That must have just seemed so out of this world. I've read some of those ceremonies from the day, and they're just incredible. I mean, they're like a Arabian Nights or something, just these incredible adventure stories is what they were.
And it does take you years unless you're Joseph Smith.
I was going to say, I don't know. He must have, just like you said, been able to memorize.
And it takes you 3 weeks.
Yeah, the amount of stuff you had to memorize in those ceremonies, it took you years because you played a character and you go through and you have to say, I mean, the temple ceremony is like that now. Of course, there's some memorization, but with Masonry, oh my gosh. And here's Joseph Smith memorizing, like you said, just copious amounts of information off the cuff. He was pretty extraordinary.
But above and beyond his abilities. Joseph Smith became a 32nd level Mason in about 3 weeks. And the rest of the Masonic lodges in Illinois were not pleased by that.
Yes.
Anyway, that's a whole different
there's a lot of
subject.
It is. There's a lot of evolving theory that really contributed to his death more than the religious element. So there's a lot of people looking into that. But
yeah, there are.
I thought it was interesting. A couple of the things that you said there was, first off, at the temple, we know there's been a couple of actors in the temple movies who have left the church. One of them, I think, starred in a porn or something like that.
That was Legacy. That was the film.
That was Legacy.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, in a church film.
The actor that played Joseph Smith. No, it was who played Emma. They later found out. I think it's done some soft core or something.
Oh,
yeah.
It's like in order to be in a church film, you have to be, pristine as the character you're playing.
I don't think that's what we mean by Women's Relief Society.
No. But then, like she said, there was, Satan has left, which, even Satan can't apostatize in church. But that very thing, like as soon as they find that out, they shut down Legacy, the movie. As soon as they changed the temple film when when that person apostatized, they took or at least changed their part out of it, so that nobody was in there. And that's so typical of what you just saw with Line. They've removed him because of the fact that he left the church, became a God-behind, and they don't want you to know about Line. They only want you to know about the ones who stayed faithful. And that's one of the reasons that they did that. But I think also one of the things that you were talking about is the church has also changed, though, with the time, because back in the 19th century, as you said, live performance was so impactful. 50s, 60s film became so impactful, and we see the history of the church with its BYU productions and the films and the movies, the old movies that Rebecca loves so much, that they produced, and they continue to do that. They try to continue to kind of match the what's going on out in the world, as we call it. They evolve and use the same technology to try to get the same reaction that they've always gotten from the theater.
Yes.
Yep, it is really important. So tell us about your book that you're writing about lions. Tell us what that's all about. That just sounds amazing. We also, I don't know if you know, Landon and I run a book club for post-nuanced Mormons. Yes, we do. We've been running it for 4 years, almost 5 years now. So we always love to talk to authors and try to, book them now. We'd like to invite you on whenever your book is ready.
Oh, that's tremendous. There are three books in the works right at the moment.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
And I'm writing them simultaneously because they're all interwoven with one another. One of them is a biography of Line, because there's been no biography of Line. And he is a fascinating guy. The first thing that I discovered 30 years ago was there was no biography of Line, but this was before all of the digitization of 19th century sources that we have now. And that reached critical mass in 2011, when Google had started in 2009. They started scanning the entire library at the University of Michigan and all of those 19th century books. And these articles started, and then the newspapers. And so I would do a search, and I would get more done in 2 hours in my bunny slippers at home drinking tea than I could have achieved in 5 or 10 years of on the ground research. And so what I discovered was that he was a sailor. He was a merchant marine. He was an orphan in Philadelphia, but he was from an educated Quaker family, and that he was a sailor. He was a merchant marine for about 7 years, between 1823 and 1829, almost 7 years. And he decided that most sailors lasted about 7 years before they either decided to be a sailor for the rest of their life or they left. And he decided that he was going to be an actor. And it's very clear that one of his heroes was the most popular actor at the time, and that was a man named Junius Brutus Booth, who was a Brit who had moved to Bel Air, Maryland. And um, I thought, well, maybe I could triangulate their performance dates, and maybe he was on stage with Booth at some point. And what I discovered was that the problem wasn't finding when they were close to each other. The problem was finding a year where they weren't.
Oh.
It became very clear that that Booth had become a mentor of his. And as a matter of fact, when Booth died, very suddenly, he wasn't expected to die. His wife gave Line the boots that he wore as Richard III, and he kept them to the end of his life.
Oh my goodness.
I didn't know any of this until the digitized stuff started coming up. And the reason that no one else knows that is that when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln, all of Junius Brutus Booth's correspondence had been burned by his wife, Mary Ann.
Were they
So there's a
related
lot.
then? Julius and John?
Junius was John's
Okay.
father.
That's what I
Yeah.
thought. That's what I just wanted to make sure that that's what I
Yeah.
was thinking correctly. So yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
So Booth's correspondence, most of it doesn't exist anymore.
Okay.
Unless it's in the archive of somebody else. Stuff that he kept, the letters that Line would have written to him, don't exist anymore. But all the way, it's just a very clear through line. And he was simply a force to be reckoned with. He was a nationally known actor, not just for what he did on stage before he became involved with LDS, but also because he was one of a troupe of actors that was attacked in St. Augustine, Florida. Several members of the troupe were killed, and it's known as the 1840 Theatrical Troupe Massacre. There is a historical road sign at the bend of the Nicolata Road outside of St. Augustine
We have to tell you something really funny. In our pre-interview that we had last week, because yes, viewers and listeners, we talked to our guests ahead of time, and Lee told us this story about the massacre. We had another podcast to do about an hour later after we got off of our conversation with Lee, and that person, known as Cultural Hall, we were asking him where he lives. He goes, "Oh, I live in St. Augustine." And we started to describe, and he lives in the little town. It starts with a P, right, Landon? He lives in, yes, that is where he lives. We're like, okay, this is
an hour
very
later,
strange.
He had a picture.
Yeah, an hour later, he sent us a picture of the site. We thought, okay, this is very strange. We've never heard of this. Now we've heard of it twice within the span of an hour. I think we're meant to go there. We love massacres and we love acting. So maybe we're meant to go there.
We are meant to go and meet up there. Yeah.
That's right.
Now we know Cultural Hall's real name is Masonic Hall. So
oh my gosh.
Mason
that's
for
his
short.
handle. He's amazing. But no, and that story's
Wonderful.
incredible. And so then I think that you had told us that surviving that massacre made him want to kind of have a whole new lease on life, right? And is that how he ended up with the...
Yeah, I'm convinced that he had PSD, what we now call PTSD, from that experience, because he almost lost his life twice in the course of that trip. I'm convinced that he went home to his wife Mercy, and he reevaluated his life, and including listening to Murphy's brother George J. Adams, who had just been converted, who had just been baptized by Heber C. Kimball as a Latter-day Saint. I think it opened him up to the message, and I think that what sealed the deal was that he went on a very long tour in 1842, from Philadelphia all the way across the Great Lakes, to the Mississippi River. I'm convinced that at that time, and we know that he was planning to, because he wrote a letter to Joseph Smith as the mouthpiece of the troop Line and Powell, meaning those are the two managers of the troop. And Joseph Smith wrote a letter back that still exists in archives that was found by my friend and colleague Noel Carmack. Noel wrote an article about Joseph Smith writing this letter back to the actor Lyman Powell. Of course, there was no actor named Lyman Powell.
Yeah.
The troop was Line and
And
Powell.
Powell.
Once I had made that connection, I thought he went there in 1843 without the troop. The troop didn't want to go to Nauvoo. He came down himself, met George Adams there because George Adams had come back from a mission to Russia. That's a whole different story.
Wow.
And I'm convinced that he saw what was going on in Nauvoo. He saw the opportunity to be a professional actor in a community that had no entertainment. And he went back and he told Mercy, look, this is what we're going to do. We are going to become the theatrical king and queen of Nauvoo. We can raise our children there. We can own a house. We can make a living. We can tour up and down the Mississippi and still come home. And Mercy was not pleased that her husband had fallen for this nonsense that her brother had fallen for, particularly because he had come back from a mission with another wife and child. And the problem was that he lied about it, and his wife, Caroline, wrote a letter that still exists to Emma Smith saying, I don't know what to do. George has come back with this woman who says that he has nothing to do with, but the child looks like him. And he says it's not his child, but I know it is. And I know he's not that kind of man. And I don't. At the time, Caroline Adams had no idea that polygamy was a thing.
Mm.
And George wasn't supposed to be practicing polygamy. He didn't have permission to do that. But George was known to do a lot of things that he wasn't supposed to be doing. So George converts Tom. Tom goes to Nauvoo, comes back. Mercy decides not to do that. She's going to stay with her son Samuel in Manhattan. And Line says, okay, then, comes back out to Nauvoo, and the rest is literally history.
I know. I always think about, so the early temple ceremony is supposed to be, basically from God, right? Revealed. Yes. But instead, I feel like maybe a lot of it, the motions, where you stand, what you do, what they say, it really literally could just be from an actor, mm-hmm. A famous actor, right? But still, it's yes. really interesting to think about that. Just the influence that he would have had. No one's aware. No one is aware of this.
Where else would this group of people have learned to be effective in what is essentially a dramatic presentation mm-hmm. when just the year before they had been in the theatrical troupe with Tom Line?
Yep. I know you're going to name...
I rest my case.
Yeah, I rest your case.
Lee, I know you've got the name for your book, Joseph's Actor, you said.
Joseph's Actor.
That's
Joseph's
great.
Actor. Hear me out here. Just another idea. He taught Brigham Young how to act. What if you named the book Line of the Lord?
Oh, that's true. Because Brigham Young's known as the Lion of the Lord.
Just an idea.
It could also be Lion for the Lord.
Lion for the Lord.
I love.
There's a lot of
is that Lion or LYIN
apostrophe? It's both, I think. Oh my goodness.
With each level that you drill down into each of these situations, the reason that the book is taking a good deal of time to write is not just the research. It's also that there are so many stories to tell that at some point this will be a podcast, because there is just too much material to just put out something that's going to be on a shelf. I think it needs to be a series. It needs to be a discussion.
And you tell the stories so well. You bring all the stories to life. You bring the era to life, and it's so completely unknown. Like it's invisible. No one had any idea. So it's this piece of history that only you can bring back to life, and that's incredible.
That's very kind, and I was quite disturbed and motivated early on in the project because I thought I've got to put this out or someone else does. And then I realized that no one else is doing this because no one
take your time.
no one else has the slightest interest in this, but but this guy is somebody who's fascinating to me. I think the next thing to do is to begin a bicentennial project because Line was born in 1806, but his first documentable public act is that he starts showing up on ship manifests between New York and England. And the first ship manifest that he shows up on is on May 5th, 1823, when he's going to Bristol. I think it's probably his first voyage, and so that's the first bicentennial moment on the timeline, LYNE. That we're going to start talking about that, and as we go up to his theatrical debut in 1829, the bicentennial of that is going to be coming up in just a few years. So I will keep you posted. Who knows, but that there will be more for us to talk about.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more and I feel like you're going to just discover more and more as you keep going. It's such an untapped resource and era. So, wow, this is just fascinating. Landon, do you have any other thoughts or questions?
I just have one theory that I want to throw out here.
Here we go. Landon's theory.
The reason the theater was so popular in Salt Lake was because Brigham Young had to find a place to take 55 first dates.
Oh. Yep, you guessed it.
Just my theory.
Just your theory. Oh my goodness.
That's absolutely right. And I encourage you to look for instances in the Utah digital database of and do searches like Brigham Young Wives Theater, because he was at the theater a lot. He had his own box. The house was divided with a rail, men on one side, women on the other, for a while. He
like the temple.
And yes, and he would have, and it wasn't necessarily his wives that came with him. He had the Big Ten. He had his daughters, whom he brought to the theater, and they would all sit together in the house. It's a shame that the theater no longer exists because it would be just a marvelous experience to be able to sit there and imagine what took place in that place. But there is more to be discovered, and I pledge to you that I will bring back more.
I pledge to you. Well, we are here and ready anytime you want to come on and talk about anything you've discovered or anything, because I think, like I said, this is a very undeveloped, undiscovered concept, but it seems to be a really important concept in the origins of Mormonism, one that's completely overlooked. So I think there's a lot more to draw out here.
Nothing makes me happier than to hear that someone else is interested in this thing that my dear long-suffering wife, Nancy, has almost on a daily basis has to listen to stories about Tom Line, and she has been incredibly supportive through this whole thing, and will also be delighted that I have someone else to play with.
Oh no, that's so good. No, and I can understand that because not having grown up in the LDS, not having anything to do with it, you of course don't care how can you, in the way that we do, where we're always trying to deconstruct what happened, what did our ancestors experience, why were they attracted to this, how did we end up where we are now because of what happened then? It's a very real, tangible thing to us that grew up in the church. And I have ancestors that were in Nauvoo at the era. So I hear your stories and I think, did they go to the theater? Were they aware of this? Did they go through an endowment? We're the apostles. It becomes very, very real. And you start to think about why they stayed in the church and why you ended up in the church. So yeah, we have a very personal connection to it. So of course, we're going to talk about it to death, right, Landon? We talk everything to death. So.
We do. In fact,
Absolutely.
We've been 2 hours, so it's probably.
I know, and we have a captive audience here with our podcast. That's right. They just
thank you for the invitation, and this has been a delight. I appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Lee. It has been really wonderful. It's such an interesting topic, and I know we'll have you back, and I know that we'll revisit some things. So please leave us your comments. Have you ever heard anything about this? Do you have any thoughts about this? So interesting, the origins of the temple ceremony and the early church and our love of theater. I mean, think about road shows, all those things. Please leave in the comments your thoughts on theater and Mormonism. And please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware of when new episodes come out, you can hit that notification bell and it'll let you know. Also, if you'd like to financially support Mormonish Podcast, we always have links in the show notes to PayPal and Venmo and mormonishpodcast.org. And thank you again, Lee. Thank you so much, Landon. And we will see you, everybody, next time on Mormonish Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.